Good morning, right? So like what you were saying, we're going to be talking about like a bit of math, but not really so much math, just like the concepts, right, behind the math and how they apply into match analysis, right? So before we even touch the math, maybe let's talk about like what is match analysis really, right? And so essentially, whenever you're trying to analyze the match, right, you're trying to measure your performance. You're trying to rate it somehow, trying to pick out pieces that you did well or pieces you didn't do well. So what are ways we know how to do this like already? Easiest way, scoreline, right? You win, you lose, you draw, right? The only problem with this is, as we all know, scoreline doesn't always reflect your performance in a match. It doesn't really give you too much detail, right? So I'm sure we've kind of like been familiarized with these kind of charts. You see them after every single game nowadays pretty much, right? Possession, shots on target, shots off target, pass accuracy. The problem here as well though is with those stats, right? If I told you a team has 80% possession, it doesn't still tell you how well or how poorly they performed, because maybe they weren't set up for possession, or maybe they were, right? Same things with shots. Total number of shots doesn't really give you a good indication how well or how poorly a team performs. So these stats, while they're definitely better than just the score line, they still don't give you a good objective way to rate your performance. So the plan for today is really, okay, let's figure out maybe an objective guideline so that we can measure not only team performance in general, but individual performances as well on the pitch. And so that's part one. It's going to be understanding player positioning, right? So how can we rate a player? How can you bring a player after a game and be like, listen, like as a defender, you got caught out here, or as an attacking player, you could have positioned yourself better here, right? How can we objectively look at that and almost rate them on that performance? And the second part of the presentation is, okay, we're going to look at passing networks. So now we're looking at the team performance in general, how these individuals come and how they interact, right? And so how can we rate that interaction and maybe find a better way of rating the performance as opposed to just looking at the stats we were looking at before. So understanding player positioning, right? These are the main questions we're trying to answer, right? How can you objectively say, are you out of position? Are you in position, right? How do you define that? What is the meaning of, often we kind of hear these terms, okay, defenders being in no man's land or defenders being caught out, right? What does that look like? What is that, again, how do we define it so we have a clear idea of what that means? And then for attacking players, when, where, and how should they be moving off the ball to provide good support for the other players on the ball? So, all right, we're going to start off with what we call a base case, right? The simplest, or one of the simplest cases possible. You have two players, you got player one on the left there, you got player two on the right over here, and they're passing a ball between themselves, right? Just two players passing a ball. Where would be the worst position for a defender to be if he was trying to mark these two players, right? If he was trying to win that ball back. So we could almost draw a line going straight between the two players because they're playing the ball into feet between themselves, right? And almost unconsciously, by playing that ball between themselves, they almost mark out zones for themselves, right? So if the ball's in this kind of area near player one, it's almost like he creates that zone, right? It's in his zone. And for player two, right, once the ball travels over, it would suddenly be player two's zone, and almost like player two takes responsibility of the ball. So naturally, if you're a defender and you're in this kind of red area here, then you're kind of like, you're putting pressure on player one. You're in player one's zone. And if you're in the orange area, you're in player two. Player two's zone, you're pressuring him. So worst possession for him to be would be what we call the boundary line between the two zones. Because once he's there directly in between player one and player two, he's neither in one player's zone nor in the other player's zone, so he's not putting pressure on anybody, right? So that would be the absolute worst place for him to be. And keep in mind, it's not just on that one point, right? Because you could be like, okay, at least he's on the passing line, so he's interfering the pass. But if you could imagine a line going all the way up and all the way down on that screen, anywhere up and down on that line, he would be equally distant from player one and player two. Right? And again, using that same logic, he wouldn't be applying pressure on either player, right? So that's kind of like the basic case between two players. Let's try expanding that a bit. So if we have 3 or 4 players, this looks kind of like a rondo now. Hey, yeah?
Good question. Wouldn't a relationship of where the goal is depend on that scenario?
Right, so...
Because him being both sides? You can pick between the two players?
For sure, right? So, like I said, this is the base case right now. We're going to start expanding and adding complexities, like, okay, what if the goal, how would this look in a match, and all that. So, right now, we're just assuming like this kind of just isolated, right? So again, now let's just add in, right, add complexity, add more players into this. So you got 3 or 4 players looking like a rondo. They're just playing into feet around a triangle or a square. Can we all agree, using that same logic we used before, right? We can draw those passing lanes between these players, and naturally, almost unconsciously, they create these zones for themselves. And so the worst position for that defender to be, we can see, is the intersection of those zones, those boundary lines, directly in the middle. And naturally, almost like the question does sometimes come up, like for example, if we look at the player on the left here in this triangle, he's standing right in the center, and you could be like, okay, well, you know, he's kind of positioning himself so that if the ball goes up or it goes to the right, he can kind of react and go either way. But realistically, the ball travels so fast, right, that by the time this player reacts to the ball going up, it's already at the other player's feet. He can't actually do anything about it. And so he's actually late in his reaction, applying the pressure. And so, again, being caught on just one of these lines is bad enough. Being caught directly in the middle at the intersection of many is even worse, right? So, okay, now taking this, let's take it to the actual game, right? Let's try to expand this a bit more. So this is going to be a play. This is going to be, if we're not familiar, the first goal between Real Madrid and Barcelona, just in that last game in December. So I'll play it back for us first, right? So Rakitic takes the ball, he goes through, and that's it, Suarez, right? And we'll kind of bring it back, and we'll kind of break it down at each point where the ball was at a player's foot, like right here. And so, right here, Rakitic comes in. We all have probably heard enough commentary about how Kovacic was caught out here, right, between Messi, right, because Messi dropped off. But if we drew a line, right, just to kind of prove the point, if we drew a line between Messi and Rakitic, you can see Kovacic is exactly between the two of them. And that's exactly why, Rakitic has a space to go into. But then if we look at all the other defenders as well, let's look at Ramos, right? Between Messi and Suarez, again, Ramos is directly between the two. He's not doing much. He's not covering, sorry, not Ramos. That is Ramos, but I think that's Sergio Roberto on the side there. Roberto and Messi, he's not covering either, right? So he's letting Roberto go off to the wing, and he's, thinking, okay, Messi's going to come in, but he's not actually being effective in applying pressure. And then finally, even Varane, right? Varane is staying wide because of Suarez. But we're going to see in a second, right, he's not actually effectively covering Suarez because Suarez still has all that space, and he's definitely not covering the space for Rakitic to run into. So right off the bat, easy case, you can see, okay, Kovacic pick him out, but also the positioning of Varane and Ramos, it's problematic because it's so wide that you're not covering your wingers and you're leaving that space for Rakitic to move into. So let's move on to the next point as Rakitic carries the ball through. So right here, right? Carries the ball past, right? Again, now there's 4 Madrid players, right, that are being caught out. Rakitic on the ball right here. Again, Kovacic doing nothing between Messi and Rakitic, directly in between. Varane he still hasn't covered that distance, right? Because he was already stuck in between Suarez and Rakitic. So he still hasn't been able to cover the distance and apply pressure on either one. Same thing with Ramos between Messi and Roberto, and even Marcelo, right? Tracking back as the fullback, he's not either coming in case Messi was somehow going to get the ball, and he's definitely not helping Ramos out by leaving Roberto go, right? So as we advance this even more, right? Finally, right, this is like the last kind of pass, right, before it goes to Roberto back to Suarez, and Suarez hits it in. This position that Ramos is in, it looks kind of familiar, right, to that slide we just had on before, right? Because now, okay, before all 3 of these or 4 of these Madrid players, they're either between one player, right, or another player. It was just one boundary line that they're on. But Ramos, right at this point, he's actually caught between, right, the keeper, which would be the goal, right? He's caught between Roberto, who's wide, and he's caught between Rakitic. So he's caught between three different zones, essentially, and that would be called like completely neutralized. There's nothing he can do at this point, right? Because even though you might say, right, you might argue, and this kind of goes back to your question now, okay, Ramos is staying goal side. He's trying to, like block off the angle of the shot and also block off the angle wide. But the reality is, like I said, the ball travels so fast that Ramos is trying to cover both Roberto and that shot to goal. He's actually covering neither one nor the other. And as we know, the result of that is the pass does go out wide eventually. He can't react to it, and it comes back across, and Ramos actually looks like he's completely lost, right? He's just turning one way or the other, can't really mark anything. So just on this side here, if we want to shift our focus, this is almost like what it looks like from a player's point of view, right? In terms of, we'll go from the Barcelona's player's point of view, because we can see how the Madrid players were out of position there, or actually like caught out, if we want to call it that. But let's look from the attacking point of view. How did these Barcelona players identify the space and then exploit it, right? So this is that initial point of the attack, right, where, right here, right, where Rakitic essentially got the ball, Messi dropped off, and Kovacic was caught between the two. And we're going to take it over here. We're going to look, okay, this is what Rakitic saw in front of him, essentially, right? Kovacic, we can kind of see how being in that no man's land, he's not really applying it. Like, if you were that player right there at Rakitic, all you see is literally a straight lane to goal, right? You're not feeling anything from Kovacic. It's almost like he's not even there, right? Because Messi stepped off. And then if we switch it over, we bring it around, we'll go to, let's say, Suarez's view, right here, right? So Suarez, again, right? We're thinking, okay, Varane, he's doing a decent job, right? Because he's kind of covering Suarez out wide. So, it's kind of reasonable for him to be in that position initially. But then if you actually look at Suarez's view, again, like the distance between him and Varane is actually like ridiculous for a winger, like Suarez especially. It's enough space. Again, he sees a clear lane from the outside toward goal. So Varane's positioning there, again, pretty much useless, right? Not covering that lane, not covering the lane to goal for Suarez. And then finally, if we bring it around again to the other side, if we take it to Sergio Roberto. So Ramos there, from this kind of view, top down, it looks like, yeah, it's decent, right? Because he's trying to cover Roberto and trying to, in case the ball goes into Messi, he's kind of positioned well there. But if you look at Roberto's point of view, it looks exactly like Suarez's, right? There's a clear lane, open lane over here to goal that Ramos can do nothing about to cover. And so these guys, Roberto and Suarez, right, seeing those lanes to goal, what they do is they keep their runs wide. They don't look, okay, Rakitic, all right, I'm going to come in and make my run narrow. They keep the runs wide to keep the indecisiveness of the Real Madrid players. Do I come in and close the space, or do I cover the wide man, right? And that eventually, right, creates that space as they keep going, and that allows those passing lanes to open up. Right. That is essentially what we call when we talk about creating triangles, right? The thing with the triangle is, because there's lots of types, like there's lots of triangles, you create an infinite number of triangles. But the thing with the triangles is you want to create, and if you look at Barcelona's plays, they create wide triangles. So what that means is the angle of the player of the ball, right? If you look at that angle there of that triangle, it's as open as it can be, right? These players position themselves so that you can create wide angles for any player on the ball. And the simple reason for that is because if you have a ball here, right, if you have a narrow angle, it's easier for the defender to cover both. But if you have two wide angles, greater distance for the defender to cover, harder to mark two guys, right? And so again, we'll come back here, we'll break it down, we'll look at every time a player has the ball on feet, what are the like they have a triangle, but what's the angle of that triangle going through? So that's one, we see Rakitic. And then coming through again, right, just to play it back. That's number 2, right? Again, Rakitic there, an extremely wide triangle, right? And then finally, as we break it down into the last play, or the last pass, a wide triangle. Essentially, it's so wide, it pretty much becomes a line, right, at that point. And so that's really the key for the attacking players. It's like, how can I position myself, A, so that that defender is stuck between me and the guy on the ball, and B, how do I keep that angle or make my run to keep the angle between me and the guy on the ball wide, open, so that that passing lane is clear, right? The defender can't come through. So that's essentially how that counterattack broke down, and it's really interesting because you actually look at like the counterattack that led to the second penalty, right? The second goal. It's very similar, and actually a lot of Spain's tiki-taka football from the World Cup in 2010, right? And then Barcelona's tactics. It follows the exact same pattern, right? It's that style of creating not just triangles, but wide-angle triangles, right? Okay, so just to kind of summarize what's going on here, right? In-game positioning. Defenders, right, have a clear picture, right, of being, okay, what does it mean if I'm going to get caught out, right? Now we know it's being on that boundary line, but really what it means to the defender is you have to anticipate the passes to move into a player's zone, right? Because if you wait for the pass to happen, then it's too late. You can't be like, okay, I'm going to stay here to mark both of these guys, right? There are exceptions if you're on a breakaway, but in general, you want to move from zone to zone, right? And that's the only way to effectively apply pressure. And then for attackers, like we were just discussing, you want to position yourself to keep that defender neutralized, meaning between your zone and the guy on the ball, his zone. Neutralize him by putting right in the center and keep your angles wide in terms of making your runs so that the angle between you and the player on the ball is wide. So moving right along into part 2, right? This is going to be a bit more about team performance. So how do we evaluate team performance as opposed to the individual performances we were just looking at? So we're going to look at these things called passing networks. And essentially what they'll help us do is they'll help us identify attacking trends, defending trends. How do we essentially shape our tactics to match our opponent, right? How do we adapt those team tactics? So first of all, what is a network? And really simply, a network is just a set of individuals, right? In soccer, it would be a set of players that are connected to each other. So we already saw in that last part, the connection between players is essentially the passing between each player. That's how players interact on a field. So if you have a bunch of players, right, you could draw a whole bunch of lines in between them, right? And that would be like a network between each player. The only problem with this here, at least for now, is like that tells me nothing, right? It's just a bunch of lines drawn between dots, right? It has absolutely no meaning as it is right now. Whereas this, at least I can read that and kind of glean some kind of story from the game. So the problem with our network as we've defined it right now is we haven't really set any rules. We just said every player can pass to any player on the field, which is true, but it's kind of simple. That's not actually how soccer works, right? So we got to add some rules here. And maybe the first one, let's add a simple rule, is, okay, now let's maybe only draw a line between a player and another player if they've connected more than 10 passes, right? And the more passes they connect will make the line thicker. And so now we get networks that look a bit more like this. So this is taken from the Euro game, 2012, I believe, right? Italy versus England. That was 2012.
That was the best performance of the Italian.
Of course. I was waiting for that, but Italy versus England. This one actually went to penalties, right? Just as a reminder, went to penalties. It was 0-0, regulation time, extra time, 0-0, penalties, and then Italy won, right? Buffon made that or Pirlo made that,
The chip.
the chip, which was nice. But so let's look at this actual network now, right? Okay, because Italy clearly dominated that game, and okay, you can see that even from the from the graph here. The only two players who connected 10 or more passes for England was this connection: Joe Hart, the goalkeeper, to Andy Carroll, the center forward.
Typical English soccer.
Typical English soccer,
It's amazing, right?
right? Whereas, of course, Italy here, right? They have all these connections going through the midfield, right? So then how come, the question might come about, it's like, how come Italy and England were tied 0-0 through 120 minutes? How could that have happened if Italy were this dominant, right? And that would, if we were looking at our stat sheet, for example, as we saw at the start, we'd see, okay, possession, whatever, 75%, shots on target, all this, right? But at the end of the day, right, it was 0-0. So this actually helps us kind of understand why that may have happened. England, as we saw, very central, very direct, goalkeeper to center forward, right? That's the only significant passing combination they had. Italy, interestingly enough, even though they have a spread out kind of looking network in midfield, they were also what you'd call very central though, right? And what that means is, sure, for example, you got Balzaretti and Montalivo with these connections and going all the way through, but Pirlo was the guy that had significantly more passing combinations than any other player on the Italian side, right? In fact, if you were to, tally it up, he had about 6 times more passes than anybody else on the Italian side. So these other guys here, they had 30 passes. Pirlo had something like 150 during the entire game. So even though it seems like they're very spread out, they're actually very central playing through Pirlo, right? And the problem with being very central like that is you end up being over-reliant on one player, over-dependent on just coming through Pirlo. And what ends up happening is that's actually very easy to defend, because now England can be like, okay, well, they're not really going through the wing, they're not really doing it, they're just going through Pirlo. Let's put an extra 1 or 2 players on it, right? If all your attacks are coming through the center, and I know they're all coming through the center, it's easy for me to defend and kind of just shore up my defense and then be like, oh, let's win it and kick it back up to Carroll, right? And that's actually why that score was 0-0 after 120 minutes. In contrast, if we were to pull up charts for someone a team like Germany or Spain during that same Euro period, right? Or even during the last World Cups, it's very spread out. The players up here, every single attacking player almost had some kind of significant contribution. It was more evenly spread out, what we would call less central. And so that kind of leads us to our first property, right? If you want to call it our first stat that comes from these networks. We call it centrality. And essentially it's a reflection of how the build-up play is distributed between players. So as we saw here, the build-up play, even though there's a lot of passes going on, the build-up play is still mainly distributed through Pirlo. So it's still central. Same with England, that's very clear, right? The build-up play is essentially through Joe Hart and Andy Carroll, right? So now let's take this and let's go back to that Real Madrid analysis using these concepts, and let's see what happened over here, right? And so I'll kind of zoom in. We'll look on this side here. Okay, maybe it can't zoom in. I guess it can't zoom in.
Oh.
I don't know.
From your slide?
Yeah, from my slide it won't zoom in.
Maybe pull up a picture.
Yeah, I'll just make this full screen here, right? I'll just make it full.
Actually, scroll down.
Yeah.
You go to the slide. And,
Yeah.
scroll down a bit. You should
Are we here? Okay. Yeah.
put it in the middle.
We'll just kind of zoom in here, right? And I'll kind of drag it around. So, okay, we've kind of, essentially what this is we looked at that Madrid, right? We looked at the El Clasico, and we took it at 5-minute intervals, 5, 10, 15, all the way up to 90, and we created those networks. We looked at the passing combinations between players, and okay, what kind of story does this tell? So, just as a summary, again, a synopsis, Madrid was pretty dominant right at the start, right off the blocks. As it went through, the dominance died down. Second half, Barcelona came out and just scored those 3 goals, right? So at the start here, we can see the passing combinations for Barcelona in red were mainly through the goalkeeper and the back 4. So already you know are already playing deep. They're playing out the back. Front 4, Rakitic, Messi. Who else was there? Roberto and oh my goodness. Who's the guy that just signed? Paulinho. How did I forget that? Paulinho, right there. He would be the number 9 in that figure. So those guys didn't really touch the ball much in those opening 15 minutes. It was mainly through, again, Busquets in the back 4. Whereas Madrid, it's spread out, okay, through the wing over here, kind of around the back, and then again through the wing on the other side. Not too much through the center, right? Mainly through the wings, but it's still a lot more domination all the way around. As we go forward, though, as we keep going through, right, we see, for example, there. For example, if we go from after that first 15-minute period where they're really dominating into the 20-minute period, over here, Madrid, right? Wings, even kind of the midfield here, and then wings kind of very dominant, right? We see those thick lines that tell us they've got a lot of passing combinations going. As we go into the 20th minute and onwards, we'll see throughout the rest of the match, that midfield influence kind of drops, and this wing influence really picks up, right? And so they're really essentially playing through Marcelo, who would be that number 4, all the way down that wing, like through Ronaldo and that entire side. The problem with that is the way Madrid was set up for the game was actually to play possession football, right? Their formation, the tactic, the way they set up, right? They wanted to build up through the back, dominate possession, right? As they were doing in the first 15 minutes, and they wanted to carry that the entire way through. But as we see, like literally right here, from 15 to 20 minutes and onward throughout the rest of the game, they started playing through the wing. So the winger, as we would say, or the fullback, Marcelo, would be the central player. Not necessarily literally central, but central in terms of all the plays are going through him. And we saw with that, in the last slide, that that's a problem because that's very easy to shut down for Barcelona. So maybe let's switch over into the second half where we see Barcelona, right? The first minute, that counter-attacking play came around 55 minutes in the game, right? This, in contrast to what Madrid was doing, is significant, right? Instead of just going through the back 4 and the wings, it's the 2 center mids, so Busquets, Iniesta, and then the entire attacking force is getting a good share of the ball. They're spreading out pretty wide. What's interesting to note here is in Barcelona's play, you got really thick line, really thick line, really thick line through one kind of side of the attacking force. And then through the other side, right, for example, this would be Messi and Paulinho. They've got actually a weak combination. So it's almost like they let one guy be a decoy, so to speak, right, just to kind of take the space and spread it out. And everyone else is getting a nice share of the ball because other guy's wide, he creates that space, and now we've got a nice passing lane to really create some plays. And that goes through again, right, here between Messi and Suarez. It's kind of weak, right? One of them is kind of dropping off and be like, all right, I'm just going to kind of take my space right now. You guys play around with the ball. And everyone else is kind of sharing it around. And it's by no means any coincidence that between 55, 60, and the 65th minute, that's when Barcelona really dominated and scored their 2 goals, right? That made it 2-0. Because their centrality was low, right? So a good share of the attacking players had the ball, and their passing rate was high as well. That's the second thing, right? There's actually a second stat that's up here. It's the passing rate. Because it's nice if we can spread the ball and everyone's going to share the ball, but if you're passing it too slow, again, defender is easy to mark and adapt. And if we just want a comparison, the passing rate for Barcelona in these moments, for example, 8.4 passes a minute, versus 2 passes a minute for Madrid. Right? And so we really see how that, combined with the centrality, really makes a big difference in terms of attacking play, right? And developing effective build-up play. So just as a summary, right? Wow. Okay, right, minute 55-65. Barcelona had low centrality, highest passing rates, most effective period of the game for them, right? 2 goals scored. Real Madrid, they did have that period between 5 minutes and 15 minutes where they had low centrality, kind of going through the wings. But for the rest of the game, it was typically very high centrality, okay? So that's one way of using these networks to kind of really look at what's going on in terms of your team and hopefully make adjustments, right? And be like, okay.
Is this stuff available to the coaches during the game?
This stuff, not as of yet, but we're actually trying to like work on a way so that like you get live feedback.
You know, like at the NFL's got tablets and they always look
No,
at
100
plays and stuff like that.
100%. Yeah. So, I mean,
If I'm a coach, I'm looking at this, I'm saying, wait a minute, I need to adjust, especially Real Madrid, they're very narrow
Yeah.
versus Barcelona spreading
Yeah.
a lot wider.
so as of, it's brilliant because I mean, it'd be nice to just like pull up and be like, oh, okay, we got to move this guy around or something. In terms of, I guess, like the top clubs, they do kind of have this, but it's more like, it's not live. It's more like at halftime, we go into the dressing room and you got a guy who's kind of pulled this up. Eventually, like, as far as I was going to get into like GPS technology and stuff like that,
That's what I'm saying, technology.
exactly, right? The technology is getting there where you could literally, like you're saying, have a tablet there and have these kind of diagrams be like, oh, okay, you know, we got to demand more from this guy or instruct this guy a bit different, so.
And I would just to add to that, because you know the application of this technology is primarily like the big use for it is because sometimes as coaches we see something happen once or twice and we assume it's a trend,
Right.
and it may not be a trend.
Mhm.
Because a trend is only when something has happened consistently.
Correct.
And so if you only trust your own memory, even if your memory is fantastic, and you can think of some top coaches who really, you know, they can remember every little mistake every player made, but sometimes when all you do is trust your memory, you lose a little bit of the, you know, the real identification of a trend, and you can clearly see there, 55th minute, there's a trend there, right?
Right.
So that's really the advantage there.
Right.
So, and if it can be done live, it's better, right? Better than at halftime or after the game when,
Yeah.
when it's too late.
Exactly. And so, yeah, this is one kind of way we can use these networks to kind of identify trends, as we were saying. There's actually a second way we can do it as well, and that would be through these things called hulls. And so a hull is pretty much kind of like a heat map, right? It's almost like, instead of heat map is just, okay, where you are on a field, right? Like your presence. This is almost like an area of influence you have on the field. So for example, this area here, right, it's a really dark triangle. That's an area of influence where, like, and what that means is Barcelona's passing in that area. They almost like dominated that area in terms of, like, they almost like set up a rondo between these 4 players and we're just playing the ball between them, right? That's what that means. It tells you not just where you are on the field, but like what areas of the pitch you're actually dominating in terms of possession, in terms of creating plays, in terms of connecting passes. Obviously, a lighter triangle means you're not very dominant, right? And darker triangle means you're very dominant. So again, kind of right, we see that trend at the start in the first 15 minutes for Madrid. They do have these hulls or these areas of blue that are nice and effective, right? And one thing we're going to see here as we go from 15 to 20, it's kind of cut off there, but you go from influential, less influential, and then no influence. Done, right? You kind of pick it back up throughout the half, but it's still nothing like you were in the first 5, 10, 15 minutes of the game. The second important thing about these hulls is the shape of them. So we see here, right, you got a nice, almost you could think about it, a penetrating shape, right? Madrid were here into the opposition half, right? Essentially, you want these hulls to be lengthwise long because that means you're penetrating and not going up and down as you see in the 15th minute, right? Being influential along your back 4 is kind of useless because it just means you're switching ball from side to side. You're not really creating any depth to your attack. So again, we'll take that and we'll maybe contrast it with Barcelona in the 55th, 60th, 65th minute. right? You always have these kind of diagonal, long, right? Not just narrow triangles or areas of influence in terms of the red, right? So that what that tells you is, okay, they're not just spreading the ball out well, but they're spreading it and actually being productive with the ball going into the opposition half, as opposed to Madrid, who are kind of just, again, playing along the back four. And so this kind of helps you identify trends. Again, sorry, did we have a question there?
No.
Oh, okay, yeah, I thought you would raise your hand. All good, yeah. Again, so this also helps us identify trends in terms of, okay, are we playing along a wing, right? Are we coming down one way? Is the opposition coming down another way, right? How are we going to respond to that, right? How do we move around players? And what you'll see, what's really interesting is, in the start, let's go back to the start where Barcelona really had to do a lot of defending because Madrid were coming at them. Madrid were tending, and we saw from the networks, they were tending down a certain wing, that left wing with Marcelo. And so what Barcelona actually did is they're like, okay, we recognize you're coming down the one wing, let's create along the other wing. They almost gave themselves an outlet. So as soon as they won the ball back from that one wing, they're like, okay, let you players on the other side get ready because that ball is going to come right to you, right? And so you see, okay, Madrid comes down this wing. What does Barcelona do? Almost as a defensive but attacking-minded defensive response, they're like, all right, guys on the other side, get ready. The ball's coming to you. And they create that area of influence on the other side. And so that's how they responded. They used, the players recognized, they didn't have this, unfortunately, like live time, but they recognized that and they used it to their advantage to create counter-attacking plays. That's really how counter-attacking plays are done. So that is the second way of using networks. So just as a summary on this side, Barcelona, right? They have several deep penetrating holes, like we said, long into the opposing half, especially from that 45th to 65th minute. And in the first half, as we just said, their shape, right, or the way that they position themselves complemented how Madrid were attacking. So they were attacking from one side. They made sure there was an outlet on the other side for them to escape from. Madrid, in contrast, right, they did have attacking hulls, right, penetrating hulls in that first 5, 10, 15 minutes. But as the game went on, they ended up with very shallow areas of influence, right, meaning they were just switching play and not really penetrating. So that's the second way of really using these networks to do an in-game analysis. And that's really the last slide there in terms of my presentation. I'm going to kind of open it up here if we had questions about anything. So, do we have questions about anything?
Farzad. Wow.
Sorry, it was a bit long, but I caught the gist of it. It looks awesome. I just had a question about how you actually collect the raw data. Is it automated for you to create these networks, or is it manual?
In terms of collecting the raw data, for these, it was kind of manual, right? Just because, again, because of technology and all that, I didn't have access to that technology, right? There is definitely the potential to make it automated, right, as we kind of discussed. Then in terms of the actual analysis, once you get that data, that's pretty much at this point, it can be automated,
Sure.
right? So,
Awesome, thanks.
cool. Anything else? No?
Wow.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I got another one. So this is fantastic as, like, say, your initial match, right?
Okay.
Have you done any other matches in order to look for trends or see if the pattern, like a proof of principle sort of thing?
Okay, no, I haven't, right, first of all, right? The second thing is, I haven't, there have been, for example, these kind of analysis were done on the last World Cup and I think the 2010 World Cup,
Yeah.
right? But it is a rather like novel way of looking at things or doing match analysis.
No,
right?
have you, I'm saying.
I haven't.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So the idea is to eventually do that kind of thing, right? But it's still kind of in the works, right? This whole thing is kind of still developing.
Sure.
Yeah.
So maybe my question, just because in the room, we've got coaches here, right?
Right.
So the let's say the main takeaways
Mm-hmm.
from our three sort of subtopics here
Right.
for coaches.
Mm-hmm.
Can we summarize those?
Sure.
Yeah.
So let's do 3 takeaways. Okay, the
Yeah.
first one would be, oh, hold on. Do we have someone, sorry, someone
Hi.
dropping in here?
Hey, how you doing? Right on time.
Let's get to it. All right, 3 takeaways. Let's make it 4, right? We'll do 2 from that first part, 2 from the second part. The first 2 kind of from that first part would be identify, right, or make sure the players kind of understand, can kind of visualize, as you probably visualize, the zones that they create by passing, right? Have them really understand that, okay. And naturally it kind of happens. For example, if like Richard and I were passing a ball between us, and the ball ends up somehow here, like Richard's not going to run all the way over and grab the ball. I know, it's in my zone, right? But that's the first thing. Make sure they really understand the concept of, okay, by positioning ourselves, we're creating these zones, and the purpose of creating those zones is to get the defender caught between ourselves, right? That way they can get kind of like, they'll be moving right off the ball, but they'll be moving with a bit more purpose, right? And then for defenders, right, the flip side, be aware of not just be aware of the movement off the ball, but be aware of how that movement off the ball might catch you out. Catch you out meaning put you directly between you, the player on the ball, and the player off the ball, meaning you can't actually mark either one.
No man's land.
No man's land, right? So being very clear in terms of what that looks like as a player, right? And what that looks like on the flip side as an attacker, right? So those would be the 2 from the first. And then from the second portion, I guess don't be over-reliant on one player. That's really the main thing, because that's really, we can play nice possession football all we want, but if you really only got that 1 or even 2 players, right, you end up being, as we call, very central in terms of your build-up play and not very effective. You end up creating these not very penetrating hulls, right, or areas of influence, and our whole build-up play breaks down. So that's the main takeaway from the second part.
Thank you. And maybe to add, is it fair to say that the more central you are, the higher your centrality, the more predictable you are?
Exactly. That's
So
really
it's easier to defend, right?
exactly.
I have one question, because I noticed when you were talking about Pirlo,
Mm.
so now, for example, the way Verratti plays, they compare him to Pirlo.
Okay.
But the way you showed the picture was Pirlo receiving the ball at half. A
Yes.
lot of the times it's the 2 center backs spreading and Pirlo or Verratti jumping back. So how would you put that on that picture that you showed us? So
Right.
Pirlo
So
receives-
let me actually flip back to that maybe. This, right?
Yeah.
So the way these pictures actually develop, it's his average position on the pitch. So on average, right? So that's why you're seeing him at half
Yeah.
and not like down here collecting the
Yeah.
ball. So on average, that's where he was on pitch, and then on average, that's how many passes he was taking. So your question is, okay, what happens if Pirlo is down here?
Yeah. So like how many, like I know, for example, Pirlo would drop back a lot, receive the ball at the back,
Yeah.
spread that field wide. How would you show
hmm
Pirlo's positioning in that?
In that sense, yeah. So what we're looking at here is like the kind of overall match,
Yeah.
right? And so like what you'd break it down into like 10-minute intervals or something, and that we could be like, okay, in this 10-minute interval, maybe it worked for us because you were dropping in and playing out,
Yeah.
by spreading the defenders. But then as the game went on, right, maybe that system didn't work, maybe they changed something in the system. And so that's how you really have to break it down. You can't look at an overall match, but you'd have to break it down almost like 10-minute intervals or 5-minute intervals and see how they played in each interval. Does that kind of make sense?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
Just, I don't know, just to like, I guess, because it's always the same picture.
Yeah.
But, where is the play coming from? How,
Okay, I think I get what you're saying a bit more now, right? So, like for example, okay, this is one picture, but you're talking about when we do our analysis here, all the players are still in the same positions, right? They're moving around, so how does that make a difference? That's a great question, and again, that's just because of the technological limitation, right? I didn't have, unfortunately, access to GPS data of El Clasico. I wish I did, right? If I did, then we would have been able to do that kind of thing, because we would have said, okay, these guys are combining, but their position was also like this. In the future, right, when you have GPS data, then you can do what you're saying, right? You can merge that and you can get even more.
Yeah.
But as it is right now, this by itself is still effective,
Okay.
right?
Because for example, like you
Yeah.
see again the way the Italians play, especially under Conte,
Yeah.
was that long driven ball across the field,
Mhm.
receive, and the cross. Right?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
a lot of the goal scoring opportunities were coming out of that back line.
Yeah,
that
yeah.
long driven ball, right?
For sure.
So if we're looking at attacking, where was the most influential part? A lot of the times it was a driven ball across the field, and
Mhm.
counter attack, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So
for sure.
that's the only reason I was asking.
Yeah, 100%. And like the answer to that is literally like it's great because that's the ideal. That's what you want that analysis to be like. It's just the technological limitation
Yeah,
at
yeah.
that time didn't allow them to do that,
Okay.
right? So that was kind of like the best they had, and eventually it's gonna get there, right? So yeah, it's pretty much it, right? Just references and stuff, but.
All right, so I'd like to thank Abdul for his presentation.